family policies, and I'll ask whether it is a remedy against the low fertility. I'm presenting mainly research from that I have done with colleagues, and the aim is not to present empirical and methodological research, but the aim is more to raise questions, also with a perspective on the LabFam research that you are doing. So we will have a few questions as we go on. I show some research that has something to do with family policies and where we can challenge the family policies, and then discuss about in which direction to shift or what kind of methodological, what new perspective should go into it. So you all know that the low fertility has received a lot of international attention, especially in the post-industrial countries, but also now just today there was a lot in the news about China and other countries. And the reason was the aging society and the very low fertility or low fertility in the countries. There are two other changes that are going on. The one is the gender struggle, I call it, because in most countries it's going towards more gender equality, but there are also some kind of backlashes that we have. And the last one is a welfare state restructuring. So the welfare state of the 1950s, as it was established, is increasingly coming under pressure from different sides. One of them is the low fertility and the aging population. In general, the family policies of the Nordic countries are hyped as an answer to those challenges. So the Nordic countries have a relatively high fertility, or had a relatively high fertility, I come to that, with a TFR between 1.75 and 2.1, which is the highest low total fertility rate. And since the completed cohort fertility rate is usually a little bit higher than the total fertility rate, it is considered sufficient to sustain a society. Gender equality in the Nordic countries is fairly high in society, speaking in employment, as well as in the family regarding care. It's a universal welfare state where everyone is supposed to be covered in a very similar way. And it is a so-called social investment welfare state. I will come to that a little bit later, what the social investment state is, but that since 2010, 2012 has been the main direction in which welfare states should move. What are the theoretical propositions that are usually brought forward for to tackle low fertility? All of them, and there are numerous empirical studies as well, focus on gender equality in the family, and therefore put forward the family policies as the core instrument in order to tackle low fertility. And I take three of the main research lines that are brought up. The first one is the gender equity theory that focuses on the macro level, saying if there is gender equality on individual level institutions, namely employment and education, but gender inequality in family institutions, so within the family in household work and care, then fertility will fall to low levels and remain on the low levels. The second one is the gender revolution theory that has a very similar proposition but focuses on the micro level. It says, if women move into employment, but the gender inequality remains within the family, women are doubly burdened and they will reduce their fertility. Only if men change their behavior and take up more of the care and household work will fertility increase and remain at fairly high levels. The third theory is also very similar to the two, but it focuses more on the gender norm, saying fertility is high in gender segregated societies in which it is the norm that women do the household work and men are in employment. But if this starts to dissolve and become unstable, so that women move into employment, men's economic potentials is reduced, then the fertility will decline. And only if a new gender norm comes up, when gender equality is more established, then will fertility increase again. All three are the same. The first one is the macro level, the second one is the micro level, and the third one combines a little bit the micro level and the macro level. But as I said, those propositions focus on the family, and they practically leave out labor market and other issues that are happening. These are only kind of indirectly involved in this. The Nordic countries are usually taken as the model for those theories. And I put in two arrows at the point where usually theories were developed quite early, before the 1910s in general, where that the increase of the total fertility rate in the Nordic countries and in all countries, relatively high, is taken as an example why the family policies and the welfare state policies of the Nordic countries are the remedy against a low fertility. We see the decline in the 1970s that is still part of the second demographic transition decline. I just say some kind of core theories there, but these are countries that recovered relatively quickly and to a relatively high level from these decline in the 1970s, and that's attributed to the family policies that were introduced between 1976 and 1984 in all Nordic countries. The second one is that they all had a decline and an economic crisis in the 1990s. I come back to that, but here again, they managed to recover, as you can see. To the rest, I come later. So that the principles of the Nordic family policies are more or less in line with what I had said before, but those are in combination now seen as the ones who push or keep up the fertility. The one is the gender equality in the Nordic countries, where there is equality in employment between men and women and equality in child rearing among the parents. But the Nordic countries have more than just the gender equality. The second issue that is very important is the social equality. It's an equality among the social group, and that means equality of opportunity that focuses on the human capital and equality on outcome. That means the social inequality within the population should be relatively low. I'm not going into the equality of opportunity very much later on, because that starts already in childhood and having childcare for every child, and that focuses also again on the gender equality. But the last one is the social investment-oriented policies. And that means that the family policies of the Nordic countries are clearly employment-oriented. It is to retain employment for everyone, irrespective of whether you have care or any other thing to do. And this is in line with the so-called social investment welfare state, whose focus is not to provide passive social security in case you are unemployed, you get some benefit, but it is even if you are unemployed, you get the benefit, but the policies are oriented towards getting you back into employment, retaining your employment, and increasing your human capital. So it's a completely different perspective. It's a life course perspective of the welfare state, that is the social investment welfare state, and it is clearly labor market focused. This has advantages and disadvantages. I'm not going into those. It's the three propositions that are central, as also the principles that are maintained in the Nordic Nordic family policies. I will now bring three examples that deal with these kind of propositions in more or less clear way. What we can see is that irrespective of the family policies that the Nordic countries have, and usually one is focusing on the high fertility, we also have two fundamental declines in the Nordic countries. The one was in the 1990s, when all countries had an economic crisis, some more severe, some less severe. I come to that later. But Sweden is the core country for a very severe economic crisis. So is Finland, that's the light blue, but Finland didn't have such severe decline as Sweden did. And I will come back to that later. But the more puzzling thing is actually since 2010. Fertility has been declining in the Nordic countries, in Norway and Finland, to almost the lowest level that they have ever experienced in their post-1940 history. And this is a puzzle, because all the family policies, the social investment welfare states, and the social equality elements have been implemented and have had a longer tradition in those countries for quite some time. So it's even more surprising to have that decline in the 2010s than it was a surprise in 2019. More later on that. So I will bring empirical examples of the Nordic family policies that will discuss those three propositions of the Nordic family policies: the gender equality, the social equality, and the social investment orientation. And look at the increase and decrease of these fertility development in the Nordic countries from the perspective to discuss whether family policies are sufficient in order to retain a low fertility. The examples come from research in which I was involved with other colleagues. The first one is the father's uptake of parental leave. The second one is cohort education or cohort fertility by education over time. And the third one is on the economic crisis and childbearing intensity. You might have seen some of those at some other presentations, but I try to bring them together to raise questions. So it's even good if you have already heard them, because then you know about them and you can more focus on what kind of problems that come up rather than what the results are. The first one, father's parental leave and fertility. So the theories say that the more gender equality in the family, the higher the fertility. But we were looking at, is a more equal sharing of parental leave increasing childcare or fertility of the second and third child more than if a couple only takes the policy, the reserved policy for the father? In all Nordic countries, part of the parental leave is reserved for the father. And at the time when we were doing that, it was not equally done within the countries. So one could say, if the father only takes what the policy recommends, is then the fertility higher than if the father shares the parental leave more equally with the mother? The theory would say the second one has a more stimulating effect. What is the outcome? This is compared to fathers who take no parental leave with the first child, comparing Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. If the father takes only up to the so-called quota, what is the relative risk compared to those where the father doesn't take any leave? What is the relative risk of the couple that they have a second child? And we see that in all countries, the risk of having a second child is higher if the father takes some leave, irrespective of whether it is up to the quota or more than the quota. But it is definitely not the case that if the father takes more than the quota, that the risk will be higher. It's only in Iceland, but not in the other two countries. In Norway, it's even reversed, and in Sweden, there is no difference between the two. What does that mean? So we can say that if the father takes some parental leave in countries that have a well-established gender equality policy, I have to say, it might not be like in other countries, then there is a higher risk of having a second child. But the intensities vary. In Iceland, if they share more equally, the intensities is higher. But Iceland had the shortest leave, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months at the time. It had the most equal sharing, and it had the most recent implementation, so it had a novelty effect. Norway has the longest leave, up to 2 years. It has the least gender equal one because the father's leave is dependent on the mother's leave. Yeah? And there you have much more on the policy conformity. And in Sweden, it has the longest gender equality, although the father's leave as a quota was only introduced after the Norway one, but the sharing was already implemented in the 1970s. And it has the most flexible parental leave, where you can take up to an eighth of a day, as Anne-Sophie told you the last hour. And there you have no difference between the policy conformity and the equal share. So we can ask, is it actually the family policy, or is it the structure and the form of the family policy that matters? Is the social investment strength of the family policy, namely the employment retention through family policies, a very important element? That would be in the Swedish case. Yeah? While the Norwegian case, it's much more that because you can stay for 2 years, it's much more moving you out of the labor market, since it's also dependent, the father's leave is dependent on the mother's leave. So it's not really equal. So we can ask, what is the social investment strength within the family policy, and what kind of role does that play? I come to the next one, to the family policies and the social equality in fertility. And here I show educational differences in ultimate childlessness. Only one example, for women born since the 1940s and for men born since the 1940s by cohort. As I said, if there is equality, low educated and highly educated should have about the same the same levels of outcomes in fertility. Oops, that should not be there. Okay. So what you can see here, that in the 1940s and up about to the early 60s or so, 1950s, 60s, that would then be the cohort that comes into childbearing ages when these family policies and gender equality policies were implemented. Yeah? Until then, you have the traditional pattern. Highly educated women have higher childlessness than low educated women. But since the late 1950s, mid-1950s, 1960s, this is completely reversing. It is that the low-educated women are now the ones that have the highest childlessness. And the highly educated women even experience, we see a drop in their childlessness, except for Finland, there it's not so clear. But in all other countries, highly educated, the childlessness among the highly educated has not increased, but rather dropped. And so is with the middle educated. So there is an increasing social gap between the low educated and the highly educated. What about men? With men, we see that the pattern has not changed that much. So it's still the low educated that have the highest childlessness because their economic capacity is the lowest, and it still is kind of masculinity that you should be able to retain a family. But what we can see is that the gap between the low educated and the highly educated is increasing in all countries. Yeah? So the childlessness might be increasing like in Norway or in Finland, but the one of the low educated is increasing more than among the other groups. Or it is even stabilizing like you have in Denmark and in Sweden, but still the low educated are, there the childlessness is increasing. What kind of conclusion can we draw? So what we see is a reversal and the growing social divergence among the childlessness of women. There is a stronger increase in childlessness among the low educated women and men. And there is a drop of the highly educated, of the childlessness among the highly educated. So in essence, we have a gender convergence. Now it's with men and women, it's the low educated who have the highest childlessness. And this is even more important, we have a growing social inequality between the low educated and the highly educated. So we can ask ourselves, since most of that development started together with the social investment welfare state and the implementation of these gender equal family policies, do we have a Matthew effect? of the family policies. A Matthew effect means that those who have will be given. So that means it's the highly educated women, those are men, who have better capacities, better human capital, better labor market changes. Do they profit more from the family policies than the low educated? Are the low educated left behind, not only with their possibilities in the labor market that they have higher unemployment and things like that, but also left behind with the family policies because they don't provide some specific family policy support that would also allow them to have children. So what we see is there a divergence in the labor market opportunities and employment patterns between the highly educated and the low educated that is even opening up. And what kind of role do the family policies play in not closing that gap, but actually maybe supporting further divergence? We don't know, but it could be. I come to the last one, the economic crisis and the family policies and fertility. This you have seen many times, and that is the second birth risks in Finland and Sweden at the economic crisis of the 1990s. Both Finland and Sweden had a severe economic crisis in 1990. In Sweden, the TFR, as you have seen before, dropped immediately and significantly to the lowest TFR all over Europe at the time, despite the fact that they had gender equal family policies and supportive family policies. While in Finland, this didn't happen. In fact, I will show more afterwards that either the intensities were retained or even slightly increasing, as you can see here. So what is the reason for that? Okay, that was I have to go back. Okay, sorry. One of the reasons that we said happened is that in Sweden, Sweden had a social investment family policies. That means it was tied to your employment and to your previous income. So if the unemployment increases and you have more women and men who cannot take parental leave because they have no income and would lose if they go on parental leave, then of course they abstain from having a first or a second child. Finland had a different kind of policy. At the time when the crisis hit, they had implemented their so-called home care allowance. They started in the 1985, I think, or 1987. They implemented a home care allowance that allowed women and men after the parental leave to stay home from work until the child was 3 years old, if the child did not take a public child care place. And that actually helped many women to dive through the crisis so that the fertility rate did not drop. Jan Holm says, but this is not quite clear because we don't know whether it was actually the policy that did this. We have no counterfactual to see what would have happened if the Finns had not implemented that policy. Is it really the family policy or is it not the family policy? In another paper with Chiara Comolli, we were looking at how did the economic crisis of the 1990s and how did the economic crisis of 2008 affect the childbearing risks? And I know whether you can see this well enough. On the, what is this now? On the left side, you see the 1990s, and on the right side, from my perspective, on the right side, you see the 2000s. And it's not only the economic crisis that is of relevance here, but it is the time after the crisis, because the TFR in the Nordic countries since 2010 is dropping. So we have to look at the after crisis development. And as we can see with the first birth in the 1990s, we clearly see how the Finnish policy, how the Finnish first birth risks and the second birth risk is the lower panel, how they did not decline, while in Sweden we do have a decline. Okay, in the 2000s we have actually a first birth decline in all countries, even though it's not at the same strength. And we have a relatively stable, but also a slight decline in the second birth risk. What could be the difference between the two? We have to say that in the 1990s, there was no globalized welfare, no globalized market yet. It was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and at least Sweden had not joined Sweden and Norway, at least Sweden had not joined the European Union yet, and the European Union was not as established as it was now with regard to labor market policies and labor market freedom that you could have. So all countries implemented individual policies in order to tackle the crisis. What the Swedes did was they cut all the social benefits from 90% to 75%, including the parental leave benefits. What the Finns and the other countries did, they did not cut the social benefits, but they retained or even increased the benefit to avoid poverty. So it could be that it is not in Sweden, it is not only the increasing unemployment that led to the drop in fertility. It could also be that it is a welfare state who kind of left out in the security that people would expect. A drop from 90% of replacement rate to 75% of replacement rate is a severe cut. And it challenges the welfare state as some state that would retain your security in case something happens. In 2008, they had already learned and they coordinated more. And they did not cut the social benefits, but they were more focusing on the vulnerable groups. And so you have a similar development, but you still cannot avoid that the fertility risks are falling. The second one with the age groups. In the 1990s, again, the same patterns, but here the upper pattern is the 16 to 29-year-old, the lower pattern is the 30 to 45-year-old. In the 1990s, you can see that only the childbearing risks of first birth were only declining among the lower age range. But among the upper ones, it was either stable or even increasing. So they were recuperating what the family policies of the Nordic countries were usually said to help to recuperate at a later age. But in 2000 and after the 2008 crisis, this does not happen anymore. The older women were also declining, or their childbearing intensities were also declining, and they were abstaining from having a first child, as you can see on the lower one in the right side. What about the educational groups? Here it's a little bit more complicated, so I will just be very brief, but you can read in the paper by Komolli what the outcome of the education is. In the 1990s, and this would be again on the left panel, the upper one is the low educated, the low and the secondary educated, the C and D is the upper secondary educated, and the E and the F are the tertiary educated. As you can see in the 1990s, it was primarily the low educated, so the A in all countries, where the childbearing risks of the first birth is declining. While this was not so much the case with the tertiary educated. The middle educated are in a middle range, so one can already see that this is the group that is vulnerable to a welfare state and family policy change. In the 2000s and afterwards, you see that again, it is practically declining in all groups, even in the highly educated ones. And that's quite of a surprise that we have. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from that? The one point is that we have to see the family policies in connection with the economic development. The SIF, so the social investment related family policies, may be more sensitive to an economic cycle. But they are also the ones of the policies that we will not be able to withdraw in the future. there will be no going back to a welfare state where one group, let's say women, stay out of the labor market and will then be retained more or less by their husband. It's because of the low fertility and the aging population, the social investment welfare state, where both women and men will have to stay in employment for a longer period of time, is the welfare state of the future. So family policies have to be looked much more with those new requirements of the welfare state that we have. The second is, we have to look on how the family policies interact with the crisis policy. Which family policies are actually weakened through specific crisis policies, not necessarily through the crisis, but through the additional policies that are taken during a crisis. Because women and men rely on the family policies and they rely on the welfare state as securing them in the case of a crisis. And the 1990s are a very good example for that. It can be that the family policies, the differences between the Swedish and the Finnish family policies led to the different development. But it can also be that the much more severe and the cutting crisis policy that the Swedes had, while the retention policy that the Finns had made the change in the fertility outcome. And second, the total fertility rate is falling much more in Finland and Norway since the 2010s than it is falling in Denmark and in Sweden. Both Finland and Norway have much more of so-called care leaves, where they offer women to stay out of the labor market until the child is 3 years old. In a severe restructuring of the labor market, as we have since the 2000s, is that policy more counterproductive while it was still working well in the 1990s with Finland? And are the policies that we have in Sweden and in Denmark that are more, where the family policies are directed towards employment retention for both in a much stronger way than in Norway and Finland? Do they prevent or dampen the decline in fertility that we see? The last one is the context sensitivity of family policies. We all know that they're situated in place and time. And so we know that now the global economy, the social, the labor market, and the welfare changes put the family policies in a completely different context than the context was when they were implemented in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s. There is globalization, there is kind of a new digitalization, there is a social change, and there is a welfare state change. So they also interact with the other policies, and perhaps more with the labor market policies that are taken, the social investment policies, than we are actually willing to acknowledge at that stage. And the last one, I go to Seltzer, who shows in a very nice paper that the restructuring of the labor market in the US had a greater influence on the fertility development than the crisis itself. So do we have a restructuring of the labor market since the 2000s that are countering the family policies, or a restructuring where the family policies are no longer a remedy against the labor market insecurities that are there? Thank you. I can show you the last picture. Whoops, no, this is not. Sorry, this was the last one. But I'll go back to the questions at the last one, yeah? Okay. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.